Well, uh, I should say, it is 10:13, Siv. I'm conscious of, it's already a short time, right? And so we try to really get started at 10:10. I wasn't paying attention. Um,
Okay,
so I think we should just begin. Today we
sounds
have
good.
Siv Dobrovolny. Dobrovolny. Can you say it for me?
It's actually Steve. Yeah, it's
Steve.
Steve. It's like Steve without the
Oh,
T. So,
good.
and the last name, don't even bother.
Can you say it though?
It's Dobrovolny.
Dobrovolny. Beautiful.
Yeah, it's Czech, and I blame Walter for that one. um, so thank you everybody for having me talk today at Faith 2020. I'm excited. I like this format because I was a teacher before I was an attorney, and so I taught for 5 years ESL, and I really like interactive sorts of teaching and learning. So at Faith 2020 matches my learning style pretty well, and I'm looking forward to teaching. Um, I want to just give a little bit of background about how I got into the area of labor trafficking and wage theft, to sort of explain my journey into this field, to explain a little bit about it. We're going to go through a case study that is sort of a composite of different cases that I've had, to give you a more, so on your screen right now, you can see the statutory definition. This is the federal statute around labor trafficking, but I want to also give you sort of a feel for what it might look like. I want to make it really clear that labor trafficking is not unique to foreign-born individuals. It's something that people who are born in the United States can also be subject to. But the hypothetical, because I'm an immigration attorney, so the hypothetical or the case study is based on a foreign-born individual. So just so you know that. To give you a little bit of background about labor trafficking versus wage theft, what's the difference between the two? If you think of it on a continuum and you think of more severe crimes on the right, less severe crimes sort of on the left, you would see labor trafficking on the right, you would see wage theft on the left. In the same way you would see murder, for example, on the right, and you would see assault on the left. Oftentimes assault is a part of murder, and wage theft is almost always a part of labor trafficking. So in the world, there's probably less labor trafficking, and there's a whole lot more wage theft. So that's kind of to put it in perspective. The way I got into this field was I fell sort of into the field. So I decided to go to law school based on some work that I had done overseas. I'd been working in a church, or not working in a church, I'd been going to a church in Turkey when I was teaching English over there. And I had come across a lot of refugees there, and I got involved in some of the issues that they were dealing with. And one of the issues that they dealt with was trying to create applications to the UNHCR to be recognized as refugees. And I saw a lot of holes sort of in the legal part of that, and wanted to go to law school and maybe see if there was something that I could do to help people in their application process to the UNHCR. And I was thinking maybe returning to Turkey. In the interim, I got married. When I was in law school, I had a child. When I was pregnant for the bar. So I had a lot of kids, and I was trying to start my career. And in 2006, I had been looking at the briefcase that I had received for my graduation gift from law school, and I hadn't actually practiced law. And so I was starting to get really concerned that I was a new mom. I wanted to be with my kids, but I also really wanted to use this degree that I got. And so I was looking for some small thing I could do within law. And I was able to find this job ad for 10 hours a week doing immigration legal clinics at these basically the community centers, like the Lao Family Community Center, the Vietnamese Minnesotan Community Center. So I would go to these places and I would screen for human trafficking. So the idea, the federal government had given the first grant to the state of Minnesota, that the state of Minnesota had in 2006. It was given to the St. Paul Police Department and to this nonprofit that hired me. And we were supposed to do training around human trafficking. It was really an unknown thing at that time. I think there's a lot more awareness around it now, but at that time, very few people really knew much about it. And so I would go and I would train law enforcement. I trained at churches. I trained at shelters. I trained attorneys just to let people know what it was and to be on the lookout for it. And then I did these screening clinics, and I would give legal advice in the immigration area, but then also, try to build trust in the community so that if there was some trafficking that was occurring, that would be brought to our attention. And so that's kind of how I fell into this field. And I feel like God really answered a prayer when I was praying to find a job. And God really answered that prayer and has provided a wonderful sort of
就
career
11 个
path
人
for me.
参加哎，
So, so yeah, and I'm going to go next into a sort of a case study. And I would really like it if people could, mute when you're not speaking and then unmute when you are speaking, just so that everybody can hear everything that people want to say. So I'm going to start. Okay, so we're going to look at some different things. What makes a person vulnerable to trafficking? What are barriers to leaving a trafficking situation? And then what are the legal issues do trafficking survivors face? So here we go with a case study. Bao met a man who came to her village in Laos to visit. He was a United States citizen, but originally from her ethnic community. So we find this pretty common in immigration, where the Hmong folks have been in the U.S. or in Minnesota now since like the 70s. And so we have people who are actually born in the U.S., but they still have a lot of ties to their communities back in their home countries. And so we find sometimes people go back and meet people in their village in Laos or wherever they're from. And then they start a relationship with that person. So this person, went back to Laos, continued to have contact with Bao through phone calls, and now we can do through email and Facebook and lots of other things. And eventually the man proposed to Bao, and he obtained a fiance visa to bring her to the US. So a fiance visa, you have 90 days to marry. So you sponsor the person, the US citizen sponsors the person that they want to bring. And then when that person enters, they have 90 days to marry the person who sponsored them. They can't marry anybody else, or they go out of status. So let me get my questions ready here. So my first question here is, why do you think this marriage proposal would be attractive to Bao? Why would she want to leave her family and friends and maybe career or whatever she has in her home country to come to the United States? Any ideas?
The vague sense that the United States is the place where your dreams can come true. Something wonderful will happen.
Yep.
You don't really give any sense from this of sort of relative wealth of the ethnic community or anything like that. So like, I don't want to assume that it's less wealthy or anything like that.
I think the man probably came back with a story that sounded really great.
Anybody else?
Maybe just the option to think that she could choose the empowered, the idea she can make a choice here, as opposed to many times marriage is assigned and everything. There, the woman has absolutely no choice and everything is predetermined. This is like a chance for her to make her own choice to do something.
Sure. Yep. Any other ideas?
There's also the possibility, I think, of being able to reconnect with other family members that might be have moved to the U.S. already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all great ideas. And I think a lot of times with the clients that I saw, there was the idea of maybe more economic opportunities. I think I looked this up, that the monthly income in Laos was, I want to say $150 a month or $100 a month. And maybe that goes really far in Laos, but the idea that maybe there are more economic opportunities, or the idea of Social Security. So we have Social Security system to take care of older folks in the U.S. That idea doesn't necessarily exist in every country. And so family members are responsible for taking care of their elders. And sometimes I found in certain cultures that the idea that the young people need to be economically stable and secure so that they can provide for the elders in their older years, to make sure that the family stays, doesn't go into poverty, or doesn't has enough economic wealth to survive, I guess. So those are some different ideas. Maybe there's education. Maybe she wants to learn English or something like that. There could be family pressure. So maybe she doesn't want to go, but maybe the family really wants her to go because they see it as a great opportunity for her and a great opportunity for the family. So there could also be the idea that she wants to go, like was mentioned, but there could also be the idea that the family really wants her to go. And being a more collective society, that may have a lot of influence. So let me go to the next part. Okay, so Bao is now sitting on the airplane. She's landed in Minnesota and she's waiting for the doors to open at MSP. She's going to get off the plane. She's going to go through the airport and she's going to be met. What do you think is going through her mind as far as her expectations for her life once she gets into Minneapolis or St. Paul? What do you think her next steps, or what do you think she's going to be?
Well, clearly there's a different set of expectations in entering Minneapolis versus St. Paul. Very different, very different situations.
Probably, I would say anticipation and excitement, and getting married and opportunities, and maybe mixed with some fear of the unknown too.
Mm-hmm.
If it's winter, she'd be facing a different climate than she might be used to.
Yeah.
She's got to have huge questions about what next. I mean, it's just got to be a big blank screen in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Does she speak English? I mean, this is a complete culture shock. And so she's waiting for somebody there that's going to take care of her, get her a place to live. Like, she doesn't know how to navigate the society at all.
Mm-hmm.
She's very dependent on whoever is waiting here for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that, I would assume, like, if she came on a fiancé visa, that she's probably thinking that she's going to get married, maybe have kids, or, whatever. Maybe if she doesn't know the language, she's hoping maybe she can get into some classes, learn some English, maybe get a job, learn some skills that, she could use if she doesn't have this kind of skills that she could make her marketable here. But she is going to be pretty dependent, like Joanna said. I think she's going to be pretty dependent on that person picking her up. She's not going to necessarily know the systems and understand how to navigate those systems, because they're going to be completely different. And especially if she doesn't know English, she's not going to be able to read the road signs or the street signs or anything. So the car pulls up to the front door of Bao's new home. The door is opened by a woman a bit older than Bao. Standing behind the woman, Bao sees 5 children. Her fiancé explains that he is culturally married to this woman and these are their children. So at this point, how do you think her sort of expectations have shifted with this new reality that's been presented to her? What might she expect now?
I mean, that sounds like a complete surprise, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, he's married. In the notes I wrote, or the chat I wrote, what culturally married is a very strange term to me, and probably to Bao as well. I
think in the Hmong culture, in the US anyway, I don't know about in Laos, but in the US, cultural marriages are, I don't know if they are right now, but they were fairly common. And the idea was that you were married within the culture. You were married by the elders or whoever performs those kinds of marriage ceremonies. but you're not married legally, in a courthouse, and so there aren't any legal. For example, this person would not be able to get a visa to bring Bao to the U.S. if he was legally married to another person in the U.S., because that would be polygamy, and the U.S. doesn't allow that. So Bao would probably be sort of surprised because she was brought on a fiance visa, and so he had to prove that he wasn't married legally.
But we don't really know that. I mean, maybe she's coming from a place where polygamy is accepted. I mean, so we don't know if this is surprising for her or not, because I mean, my presumption would be she wouldn't know US law to know that he could not legally be married to two women. So anyway, I'm
Yep,
not saying
true.
it wasn't, I'm just saying this is a chance that.
Yep. I'm going to say for the case study, let's assume that she is surprised. But I think in Hmong culture that polygamy is not unheard of, and it is not unaccepted. So. Well, if we think about resources within the family, there's going to be a resource shift here. So if Bao is thinking she's the only wife and that it's just him and her, the resources that are available to her in that scenario may be quite different than the resources that will be available to her in a scenario where there are 5 kids and another wife, depending on, I guess, earning power of the other wife. But that could mean that she has other duties, maybe childcare duties, maybe household duties, as a second wife, that would be different as if she was the only wife. So I think that the shift would occur around the resources and what might be available to her for, like, going to school, learning English, working outside the home, all of that, assuming that she doesn't speak English already. So I'm going to move on. So this is a chart that I got from the U.S. Department of Justice, and this is their Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. And they looked across, in human trafficking, they looked across to see what sorts of backgrounds or what sorts of things made people particularly vulnerable to traffickers trafficking them. And these were some of the things that they came up with. And this is human trafficking, so it would include both sex and labor trafficking. And today we're focusing primarily on labor. But this is, you can see on here, immigration status is one, education level, English language ability. So in Bao's situation, assuming she doesn't know English, and maybe has less education, also cultural background. So there are different vulnerabilities that may increase her susceptibility to human trafficking. Okay, let me just. Okay. So I want to spend just a minute on this and talk for a second about, so I know in the blurb that was in the announcements, I talked a little bit about how I see immigration policy, U.S. immigration policies affecting both wage theft and labor trafficking. And the reason why I see a connection is because historically, we have had things called amnesties, where we have allowed people who are large groups of people who are out of status to gain status, to receive amnesty so that they could sort of forgive, whatever they needed immigration wise to be forgiven for, so that they could to be full members of society by being able to have a legal status in the United States. We haven't had that for many, many, many years now. In fact, we've had under the Clinton administration, we had immigration reform that resulted in things like the 5-year and the 10-year bar to entering the US, and the permanent bar. So these are things that actually stop people from gaining legal status, that permanently bar them from gaining legal status. And so we have a large population now where people have lived here for quite some time, but they're unable to be full members of society because they cannot get immigration status. It's impossible for them to get immigration status. And so when you have people who cannot be full members of society, so I'll give you an example. Some of my clients can't in the past. When you don't have a social security number, it makes rental difficult. So when people get an apartment, they want to stick with that apartment. And so they're going to put up with more junk from their landlord, not fixing things or not having a decent place to live because it's difficult for them to rent. Also, same thing with jobs. So you get something, you get a job and then your employer gets a letter from the government saying that the social security number doesn't match the individual's name, and it's called a no match letter. And the employer will then, oftentimes let the person go because that's an indication that they don't have legal status to work. So people end up having to take whatever job they can kind of get and get paid perhaps below minimum wage. Maybe they don't get overtime. Maybe they, have other situations where they're sort of tied to their jobs and they try to keep the jobs because they're afraid of what might happen if they lose that job. So that's kind of the connection I wanted to make, or how I see it. And again, this is not the Minnesota Department of Labor's view or anything. This is my own personal view of how I see these vulnerabilities that are increased for certain populations of people. And that makes them sort of preyed upon by both people who exploit labor from a wage theft perspective, and also people who exploit labor to a greater extreme under labor trafficking, like not paying overtime. It's things that are covered on the Fair Labor Standards Act. So it's things like not paying overtime to employees, not paying minimum wage, not allowing breaks when they're legally allowable, not giving people their final paycheck. So we oftentimes see at the Department of Labor, we get calls in from people saying, I was either fired or I quit and my employer kept my final paycheck and never paid it to me. These are all things that are considered wage theft and that employers engage in quite frequently. And labor trafficking, is where somebody's actually controlling the decisions of another person. It's much more similar. This coercive control, this idea is much more similar to what we see within domestic violence. So the idea that it's not safe for you to leave. You don't feel safe enough to leave the situation. You don't know how you're going to survive, or you're threatened. Other things are happening. And that's the situation for labor trafficked individuals. They are being controlled by another individual. So it's a more severe, much more severe form of wage theft. Okay. So I want to talk for a second about what the Bible's, look at some scripture and some things that I've seen that sort of really spoke to me when I was reading them. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. So when I read this, it's sort of, the wage theft idea is certainly there, failing to pay workers what they're owed, wage theft or labor trafficking, and the idea that we're benefiting from it. So I think that's the part that sort of disturbs me, because being a full member of society, having legal status to live and work in the United States, having the ability to change jobs, having the ability to move housing freely, I benefit from the people who serve me in restaurants. I benefit from the food that I eat that's picked at sub minimum wage and lower. I benefit from the COVID that the workers in the meatpacking plants had to suffer so that I could, get my meat on time or whatever it was. And so I think that's the part that kind of disturbs me and why I believe in this field that I'm working in. Then I will draw near to you for judgment against those who oppress the hired workers and their wages, against those who thrust aside the alien and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts. So again, the idea of not paying wages to hired workers and not, you know, and treating immigrants in a different manner. So these are, I'd be curious if anybody else has any comments about the scripture or anything that you, otherwise we'll go back to the case study. I have some more with that, but I guess I didn't really have a question about it, but maybe people had a comment.
I'll just jump in and say that I appreciate you showing these, and I think it's pretty easy to not see that other people are exploited. I mean, I think our culture is built, our economy is built on not seeing how other people are exploited. And so the scripture is very pertinent.
Yeah, I think that opening our eyes to this kind of oppression or this kind of injustice is just another thing to be aware of. And at the end, I have some ideas of things that we can do. So
I work with refugees, and I'll just say there's a lot of stuff about our culture they don't know and can't quite understand, but their poor workplace environments is one they're quite aware that they have a pretty bad situation, and that they're not treated well. I mean, that's something in general that there's not a whole lot of question about.
Yeah, you can definitely feel that, right? Or know it. Yeah. So I'm gonna just kind of flip back to the case study quick and address a couple more things, and then we'll look at some things that we can do around these issues. So what are barriers to leaving a trafficking situation? So it gets worse for Bao here. The man took Bao's passport and she was given a mat to sleep on in the cold, unfinished basement away from the rest of the family. Her mornings started earlier than everyone else's with cooking and cleaning. During the day, she took care of the children. Bao was never paid and had no access to money. She was isolated at home with no phone, no key, and no transportation. So what are going to be the barriers to her leaving? Like if she wanted to leave, what's going to keep her sort of in this, or make it very difficult for her to leave?
If she leaves, she has no legal status to be in the US. And if she does get shipped all the way back home, she returns in shame because this has happened to her. So it's shame to return, or there's the complete inability to sustain herself without help. So, I mean, she is nowhere.
And presumably she's been isolated at home. I'm assuming she's had no opportunity before the isolation to establish other connections with anybody. So she really has learned nothing about navigating life in this case, the Twin Cities. What can she do? She can't get out. And if she did get out, how would she manage it? So she's really trapped.
And my experience is the idea of a shelter, that there's a place she could go, is completely unfathomable.
Yeah. So in these situations, I mean, if we imagine ourselves in this situation where, you know, let's say I'm in China somewhere, I don't speak Chinese. I can't read, you know, Chinese. I don't know what those signs are saying. I don't know how to get on a bus. I don't know how to get to a bus stop. I don't know where the bus stops are. You know, I don't have any money to pay for the bus. I wouldn't know where to go if I got on the bus. So without knowing anybody in the community, or without knowing, you know, sometimes I found in some of my cases where if there's a child involved, like the child's teacher, the person would somehow have a connection with the interpreter who helps connect the kid to the school, or other weird connections, or maybe somebody who cuts their hair, or who, you know, if the person had any sort of connection with the outside world, That's sometimes how they get identified, but they also sometimes get identified by literally being unable to stay in the situation any longer and going out and wandering in the streets to get away. And in those situations, you know, sometimes people call the cops, and then the cops show up and try to see why this person is wandering the streets. So it's a labor trafficking. I think sometimes we think, you know, how do these people get in these situations, and why don't they just get out of them? You know, why don't they just call the police and get some help? Well, the idea that, you know, how do you call the police? What's the number? How do you dial the phone? How do you have access to a phone? Now with cell phones, you know, at least when people had landlines, people could pick up a phone in a house. But with everybody having, you know, people having cell phones, they take the phones with them when they leave. The person doesn't have a key to the house, and so they're afraid if they leave, they're not going to be able to get back, or, you know, whatever. So there are a lot of barriers to leaving in these kinds of situations. So I'm running out of time here. I better move it. What legal issues do trafficking survivors face? So the man never married Bao, and she became pregnant with his child. This fiancé visa expired after 90 days. I didn't even talk about all of the sexual abuse that goes on in these cases. But anyway, the fiancé visa expired after 90 days, and Bao's immigration status changed from being in the United States legally to violating the terms of her visa by overstaying. Bao has lost the ability to legally remain in the United States to work, to drive a car, or to get a social security card, which can affect her ability to rent an apartment, obviously, and to have transportation to get it, you know, to get a job. So when I have cases, when I was working for the nonprofit, when I had cases like this, I would look at this situation and I would try to identify all of the legal needs that this person was going to have. And then I would try to see what I could do and what I was not going to be able to do, because I don't practice in all areas of law. So in that scenario, obviously she's going to have an immigration issue. If there had been a legal marriage, there may be a divorce issue. There's going to for sure be a custody issue when that child is born. There could be a criminal prosecution of the trafficker. So if she reports to law enforcement, she's going to want an attorney to advise her about how to get a sort of a certification from law enforcement saying that she is a victim, and that would help her in her immigration. So the criminal and the immigration sometimes will go together to be able to prove up the immigration case. There could be over on the other side here, there could be an order for protection. So if there is violence between him towards her, or threats of violence, she may want to seek an order for protection so that he couldn't have contact with her. Housing is going to be an issue, not necessarily a legal issue necessarily, unless he put her name on the lease. So sometimes I had clients whose entire credit was destroyed, because that's the whole point, that they were actually brought. They were brought over so that they would get them legal status, and then what they would do is ruin their credit or use their credit. So that can affect like housing in the future and other things too. Identification and document recovery. So if he destroys that passport, now we have a huge issue, because now we have to get a new passport issued out of out of Laos, or out of a consulate or something. And so you have to find where the person could get new identification documents. Somebody's got to pay for that. So there are a lot of issues that come up in cases like these, and they're not very easy to solve. So we just have a couple more minutes here, and just want to I want to encourage some action steps to familiarize yourself with legal resources. So there are different legal aid organizations in the Twin Cities. And if you just type in Google legal aid, those would come up. There are other workers' rights organizations, and this is becoming bigger and bigger, I would say, in recent years. There are different sort of, like we have CITUL, which is sort of a Spanish speaking or looks towards Spanish speakers to help them in their to organize around asserting their rights in the workplace. And there are other organizations that seem to be popping up now. So that would be another thing to sort of get involved in. encouraging your employer to act fairly, and if you are an employer, to act fairly yourself. So to understand what the law is, what the legal requirements are around employment and paying workers their wages. So those are just a few ideas of ways to engage in this arena. But I'm happy to answer. We have like two minutes, I think. Happy to answer any questions or get any feedback.
I just, how would someone like Bao get to you? Like, what would?
So in a situation like Bao, so sometimes there would be an interaction with law enforcement if there was abuse going on in the home, a neighbor, or there may be a call to law enforcement, or law enforcement may come, or the person may try to exit. Sometimes they are able to get some, like through the grocery store or somewhere, they make a connection to somebody in their ethnic community, and that person may refer them. There's a particular shelter called Asian Women United, and Asian Women United, it works specifically with people sort of in this kind of situation. So if they can get to a shelter, then the shelter would contact me, and that's how I mostly got into contact, was through the shelter. So I wasn't the one that, helped people exit the situation. It was either law enforcement or shelter would contact me.
A big thing, while the pregnancy is kind of, it's sad, it's like it's going to get complicated, that usually mandates some contact with the medical community. And that's where the work I do comes in, because we really watch carefully if there's any prenatal care, or if there's not, that's a big red flag, or during delivery, trying to really observe the interactions and help the woman find out about resources that way. So it's kind of a good part that comes from the bad situation.
Yep. And that's another area of contact, would be with medical personnel.
And just from a sense of justice, I mean, are the perpetrators chargeable under current law? I mean, maybe there's a lot of, ways that they can sort of duck and weave. But I also think of the home country where they come from. I mean, are they seen as pariahs, or do they go and do this time and time again?
So we do definitely have cases where people have gone back multiple times, and we have relationships with the Department of, I'm losing it. The people who give visas to bring people to the US. I can't think of it. Anyway, they flag people. So we will call them, and we will say, we believe this person has returned multiple times to their home country to bring other women and abuse them. And so we will call and report, and they will flag. But yeah, it is very difficult to get a prosecution. It's very difficult to get law enforcement. Labor trafficking, obviously, who investigates labor? Department of Labor, other generally speaking, law enforcement agencies investigate labor historically. So we're trying to, with the new wage theft law that has criminal provisions and other things, we're trying to sort of loop in law enforcement, and like, this is how we can work together to investigate labor. And then you investigate the course of control that this person has on the trafficking part of it. We will investigate how much money this person is owed. So it's a work in progress, I will say that.
Were you thinking of Immigration and Naturalization Services or something else?
No, it's the Department of State. It's
okay.
State Department. They're the ones that grant they're the ones that do all the stuff overseas. So we would call the Department of State, and we would say, visa, in your visa processing, in the consulate overseas, please flag this so that this person can't continue to bring people.
Hey, Steve, I just wanted to say we can go until 10:55 or 56, but we need to stop at that point so people can go.
Yep.
And I also, we talked about telling you what's in the chat. Ju Chang put in some commentary about polygamy in Laos and the Hmong culture. So just in the chat for anybody who hasn't seen that.
Can you give us some sense of scope and frequency in the Twin Cities of trafficking, or pick your subcategory, scope and frequency?
Yeah, I think that there are no good statistics on this. You know, we have a report that comes out every year, and they basically they're surveying, you know, shelters and law enforcement and other people to see those people who have identified labor, particularly labor trafficking. And I think that it's like, as you can tell in this situation, it's a very sort of hidden crime, and actually getting people to identify it as what it is. So if you call law enforcement is going to come to the home. They're going to say, this is a domestic violence situation, or this is a domestic situation. These people need to be separated. You need to be out of the house for 24 hours, or, you know, whatever it is. Or you need to leave, or I'm going to take you to a shelter. But they don't necessarily identify it as trafficking. So it's almost like they have to get it to an attorney, an immigration attorney that, you know, is going to be able to identify it as such, or there needs to be a lot more training around law enforcement. So I can't answer that question. I'm sorry, Fred. I wish we had better numbers. I do think that it happens more frequently than we ever identify. Identification is an enormous problem.
It's interesting what you say, though, brings up another thing in our current climate of what do police forces do? It sounded to me like you brought up another instance where a sort of a more broad-based what to do at the scene of a disturbance, you know, bringing other kinds of social service resources to bear on a given situation, where police, as popularly conceived, doesn't necessarily handle that immediately. So.
Yeah, definitely in this situation, you know, they may need protection, or, you know, somebody may need to get arrested, but there needs to be a whole lot more.
I have a question about that identification, Steve. Melissa and I frequented a Thai restaurant that we loved, and about 3 years ago, it shut down because of trafficking. And because we frequented it, we felt horrible and were wondering if we missed obvious signs. Was there anything we could have or should have been looking for?
I think, and I know that case. I think, you know, I think that people who are living where they work, but that's not something that you're going to see necessarily as a patron. But people who go in to do, we're training also people who go in to do safety, like who do like the food and health inspections and things like that. Because if you see that somebody's living in the place where they're working, then that's a huge indicator that there may be trafficking going on. As a patron, I think it's very difficult to identify unless you see it. Like child labor is one that I think you can probably identify a little bit better. You know, if you see somebody really, really young working at a restaurant, that's not so that can happen if it's the parent. But I think that sometimes child labor, you could identify that way. The person, if you were so frequent a customer and you got more of a trust relationship with that person, and they gave you some indication. But yeah, it's really tough. So it's about 5:02. So I think
Yeah,
we should probably stop.
well, I just want to say thank you. I mean, it's eye-opening, it's disheartening, and also heartening, right? Because I'm grateful that you are doing this, and makes me want to keep my eyes open. It is about time. Can I just say a prayer for us as we close?
Great.
God in heaven, thank you so much for this time and this information that Siv has given us and the work she's doing. God, we do pray for the clarity and your mercy on so many in our culture and our worlds we interact with. We're here for courage to do the right thing too. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, Siv. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Steve, this was great. Thank you so much.
Bravo.
Thanks, everybody.
See ya, everybody.